Decline of the black community and black men. I think we think back and we think of the worst days among African Americans as being in the past. Um, but maybe now is one of the worst times in some ways. Not if you look at raw economic data, but if you think of the possibilities of what could have been, and things like marriage rates and many of the cultural problems that are taking place and what they could mean in the future. There was a time when the black community had a lot of businesses in it that were black owned and run and successful. But I think the decline from the past to today, in my mind, started with integration. And you might ask, why? How could that be? Because that was kind of a goal of the civil rights movement and so on. But one of the things it did, it created a negative economic flow in the black community, because money that was being spent by African Americans within their own community suddenly started to leave. It started being spent at places. For instance, there used to be a lot of black hotels and inns and places where black families would stay when they were traveling. Well, those quickly couldn't compete with places like Holiday Inn and so on, and they quickly closed down within a matter of years. So that the money that was being spent in the black community was now flowing out. Another example would be restaurants and so on. So these businesses that were thriving in the black community were suddenly gone, which meant that the money that stayed in the community and went towards all kinds of infrastructure and so on in the black community was gone. Another thing that happened was the creative and business-minded black people in the black community that would have started businesses, say, like McDonald's or so on. Most of those people were suddenly gone. Suddenly they were working for the mainstream companies. And so all that creativity to make things happen and all of that brain power to make things happen and change things in the black community, all of a sudden it was gone. And not only did these people, their force of change, not only did that leave, many of these people left the community, started living in other places with integration. So they weren't really consciously aware anymore of what was going on in the black community. The black community became, for lack of a better word, sort of an amorphous thing, because black people didn't have their own neighborhoods as much anymore. That started to disintegrate. So the people left behind were more so the people that didn't have the wherewithal to leave. So this created a new environment there in the black community that hadn't existed before, where socioeconomic classes weren't together to sort of help and influence each other in different ways. Suddenly they were separated by space. And that had a negative impact too, because now if you grew up in a family that was having problems and dysfunctional, you couldn't just look across the street to somebody who was doing positive things. Those people were gone now. They lived in different places. So integration had that effect. Integration meant that children were in a white environment where a lot of the teachers were negative towards them, and I experienced this myself. And suddenly that kind of influence you'd get from a teacher who might inspire you was gone. So the sense of community in that sense was gone too. And of course, these things were wrong in that African Americans were limited in where they could go and where they could be educated, but with that was also the sense of community. And with integration that left, that was diffused, that was diminished greatly with integration. The decline of the black community and black man is something that I've been observing, and integration was part of it. But another thing happened at about the same time, and I like to label this the influx of Trojan horse philosophies. The black community abandoned Christian ethics largely, and these were replaced with more of a self-fulfillment kind of mentality. And that led to all kinds of problems, because to have a family that's strong, a family that raises functional children that are good citizens, this takes a commitment. You can't always be serving your own pleasure with your time. You have to invest that in your family. Well, this was being looked down upon in a lot of ways. There were all kinds of other philosophies coming in too. Feminist rhetoric, I think, was a big part of the decline of the black community and black men. All of a sudden, women were made to feel dissatisfied with the role of wife and mother, and self-fulfillment was installed in its place. Well, especially for African Americans, we need strong parents. We need strong mothers and fathers because the outside influence of the world really grates against us. And we meet all kinds of obstacles outside the home. So when we come home, we need parents that are going to build us up, correct us, give us the inside knowledge we need to survive and to progress. And feminist rhetoric did away with that to a large degree because women were being told that they shouldn't be satisfied with being wives and mothers. And now I agree that a woman's life shouldn't be solely that. But for that time in a child's life when they're young, the mother and father both have to invest time and energy, and that was being made to seem like it was a self-sacrifice that was taken away from a person's life and not putting something into it. Another thing that happened in the black community was Marxism. I think about the Black Panthers, and even Black Lives Matter today. These organizations have seemingly good goals, and definitely the Black Panthers did. But Marxism has a lot to say that's anti-Christian as well, and Marxism has a lot to say that's dysfunctional as well. And both those organizations adopted that philosophy, unfortunately, in my mind. And decentralization of family and towards the state is not a good thing. I would just say, I won't even say my opinion, because it leads to a kind of diffusion of the family. It leads to kind of an expectation of the government serving you rather than you serving yourself. And those things are both long-term disasters. And those things crept into the black community as well. They seemed like they were going to bring about short-term gains, but in the long run, that isn't what happens. In the long run, it begins to diffuse everything, disintegrate everything. And instead of an individual taking control of their own destiny, it becomes more of a groupthink mentality, which is a dangerous thing in other areas as well. The last thing I think led to the decline of the black community and black men was this shift towards anti-intellectualism and dysfunctional male role models. Think back to the time of the civil rights movement. You think of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and men like James Baldwin as well. These were all very intellectual people. And even the Black Panthers were educated men who were intellectuals. They were all college students, which people don't realize that a lot, that that's who these people were. Well, again, with integration and with the influx of these Trojan horse philosophies, seeing male leadership was being frowned upon. This was seen as the patriarchy that was going to control and damage everything somehow. And a lot of these men were not in the black community anymore with integration. They were working for corporations. They were working outside and in organizations that were not African American anymore. They're mainstream. But one of the things that happens when economic control is lost in a community is you're suddenly subservient to the people you work for. So if you see things in society you don't like, or that you don't agree with, you want to change, if you start talking about it, you get fired. You lose your money, you lose your house, you lose everything. And so we saw a decline there as well, because all of a sudden the black men who would be leaders had to be quiet now, because they are economically dependent on the mainstream society. And you look at a man like Martin Luther King, of course, he got his money to live off of in the black community, so he could say what he wanted to. He could stand up when he saw something wrong. But all of a sudden, because of integration, the number of men who could do that was greatly reduced. Another thing is economics sort of drives who the role models are. Now you look in the black community and with integration, all of a sudden, I think I mentioned this before, the people who were like professionals, the people who were doctors and lawyers, the people that even were factory workers, they were gone now. The black community that we think of, the black neighborhood, the hood, the ghetto, it wasn't always just this group of people who were pretty much poor and underprivileged and culturally deprived. It was everybody was there. With integration that left, it created this kind of environment where the black role models weren't really these kind of people who were industrious. They weren't carpenters, they weren't plumbers, they weren't doctors and lawyers. All of a sudden, the men who seemed to have the influence and the money were all people who work in sort of the black market and subterranean economy. They were the drug dealers and people doing all kinds of illegal stuff to make money. People who were doing unethical things to make money became the role models. So the media fed into that. You think about the rappers who are all drug dealers and murderers, at least they portray themselves as that. Those became the people that people looked up to. And these became the role models that seemed sexy and that seemed attractive. So when you combine all these things that happened, all of a sudden, with integration sort of being the first domino that was tipped, the black community became something else. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't black people that are progressing, because they are economically and other ways. But a huge portion of the black community sort of fell into kind of this age of darkness where the role models were gone, the influence of Christian ethics was gone, and now we see this dysfunctional period that many neighborhoods, that we call ghettos, are now. They're having problems because the marriage rates fall, because the ethics to get married are gone. The desire to actually be a good wife or a good father, that's been abandoned. And the role models are really dysfunctional guys who can't be leaders. So the only way to turn this around is to actually put energy in the other way. Just throwing money at the problem is not going to change anything. All kinds of government programs won't change anything, because really what we need is an infusion of all the energies that were there before. We need black businesses back. We need for the male role models who are creative and industrious to come back and have their influence there in one way or another. And one way they could be was if they would open businesses in these neighborhoods. And then people could see these examples up close of people that are doing productive things with their lives and aren't thugs and gangsters. But as far as what's happening now, it's just a vicious cycle that's feeding on itself. But I have hope that given the right plan of action and given people who put time, money, and effort into it, things can change.